I would like to thank the conference organizers for allowing me to present my latest research, in addition to Nassau Community College, part of the State University of New York, for their support, and FRAC for previous and we anticipate future research-related travel support. As many of you know, I've been looking into the Ulfberht swords for a number of years now. But what I was wondering was, why do our results disagree with many previous claims? And when I was really looking at it, it's that other sword studies start with Petersen's typology, and they assume that this is also chronological, but this is not the case. There's a fundamental problem with using Petersen's typology for dating, and that's because Petersen's typological classification is not typological seriation. They are different things. In order to do typological seriation, you need to look at tens of thousands of samples, and they have to be in secure contexts, and the results have to be cross-checked with artifacts with known dates, and usually with methods of absolute dating. This is not what we have. Petersen looked at about 2,000 swords. While that is an enormous feat, and his classification is wonderful, as are other people's classifications, but there's a difference between classification, which is creating groups or clusters, and using those to date something. It's not that it's impossible, but you need to, as we said, look at tens of thousands of objects. Typology indicates the frequency of production, preservation, or recovery, but it does not in itself indicate a date. So my research questions are, if the different pommel shapes do not indicate a gradual change in style, what do they represent? What can they tell us about the lifestyle of the people who lived in the past? Because that is really our ultimate aim. We wanted to use a method that reduced bias and assumptions. So we just looked at primary evidence that had firm provenance. Then we did evidence characterization to generate the data. We did data analysis. And then for the explanation, we applied anthropological theory. This period of time witnessed the change from going from tribal cultures to settled kingdoms. So we wanted to make sure that during this research, we were not prejudicing ourselves to either assume that people were either tribal or in a state society. Neither are they all pagan or versions of Christianity that we recognize today. To recap some of our earlier research, because the Pommel research is not really based on this, but it complements it. Our research, when we started in 2016, we looked at Stolzberg's classification of 166 Ulfberht swords. That was our what we got from most of our database. We also looked at Williams, who looked at the material characterization of 44 Ulfberht swords, looked at other archaeological evidence from Northern Europe around the same time, and we noticed the import of silver coins, and mostly coming from Central Asia. And we also looked at historical documents, the sagas and the chronicles. These we are considering to be archival testimony. We are not judging them in any way for whether or not they are accuracy. All we're saying is that they are testimony to what somebody said or at that particular point in time. What we concluded was that the date of the production of the Ulfberht swords was around 935 CE, and their appearance in Norway should be associated with Håkon the Good Haraldsson. We continued with the research, and in 2018, we were discussing about how we filtered and sorted the swords to down to about 59 swords, and we looked at the into different groups, and then we compared this to the other archival testimony, again the sagas and the chronicles. And what we concluded was that the swords were distributed by King Athelstan of England to his nephews, including Haakon, which we believe is one of his nephews. And then Haakon distributed the swords to his uncles and nephews. We think that the Inglery swords might be Alan II of Brittany, but we're still we're not 100% sure about. The ones that have Ulfberht on both sides seem to be Edmund I and Edred. It is those are Athelstan's nephews. The third one here we believe is Olaf Sigurdsson or Ablam Koran, same person. He was also Athelstan's nephew, and the final one here being from Louis, belonged to Louis IV, also Athelstan's nephew. The other swords would belong to Haakon the Good Haraldsson and his nephews and uncle, his uncle Sigurd, then his nephews Tryggvi and Gudrud, then his uncle Thorgil Spraklin, and the others which were yet to determine would also be Haakon's other nephews. When we looked at the evidence, it seemed clear that Haakon is Athelstan's maternal nephew. One, the sagas always refer to him as Athelstan's foster son, and we know that his mother was Thora. They said from the family of Hortakari. That's what they also say in the sagas. Well, also that's really all you need. All people would have needed to know, because if he was his foster son, right there, they would have understood it as that Athelstan was his uncle. And new research has shown that there is a pattern of fostering of Norse children in Ireland, England, Scotland, and other locations from this period of time. And we know from the Anglo-Saxon chronicles that there was a pattern of other young men who received swords from Athelstan, and those are the ones who are known to be his nephews. So this really starts to help explain events and some unexplored kinship relationships. For this latest research, we took those 59 swords and only kept those where we had 4 or more examples of. This way we could be sure that, or fairly certain that they occurred and they were real groups, real made in the past, and that there was no worry about of like extra pommel, a different pommel being put on, or if it was quote fake or forgery as people have claimed them to be. This left us with 30 swords. So our question then was, well, if the different pommel shapes don't indicate the change in style, what do they represent? And how can we use the information that we used, that we learned before, to understand the relationships between the pommels, between the different steels, between the different obverse marks and reverse marks? For this, we used basic data visualization, as you can see here. So what we did this so we could examine the connections between the different groups in a new way, but by using Venn diagrams, it does not limit you to the number of possibilities, and it's objective. So that's why we started by looking at using these Venn diagrams. One thing that also seems pretty certain is that the Swords are related to Christianity somehow. That is deduced by the crosses on it, basically. And also, because we know from historical texts that churches were involved with making swords. But the thing is, the theory with the Ulfberht blades has been that either there's a maker or that it was from a single monastery. And that is where one of the assumptions where people go wrong, because these are not full market economies where you have large centers of production, advertising where you could advertise a maker, things like that. It doesn't fit the culture, and it doesn't at all fit the evidence. But what we do know is from that time, it was the Benedictines, the rule of Saint Benedict, that was basically the wave that was taking over in the churches in Europe. But it's not the same. It's not like one single unit. The thing about the Benedictines were that there were different ways to basically worship God. The earlier way, you have hermits. These are people like your anchorites who are known to have, there's people mentioning that they were involved with making swords. But you also have monasteries. This is your what they call like cenobites. These are when you're getting your large congregations together. And those like usually your monasteries in the Western Church or the skets of the Eastern Church. And for that, for example, we have the plan of St. Gall's that has an area where they're setting up a place for blacksmithing. So we know that there was not one correct way, one workshop. There was, at this time, there were individuals making swords. There could have been small groups of people making swords, and they could also have been being made on much larger scales in the monasteries. I want to mention about St. Gall. I think he's quite important with this. He was one of the traditional companions of St. Columbanus, who the important thing is he was born in Ireland, studied in Ireland, and then died as a hermit in Switzerland at Lake Constance, where later I will be showing you some of the images from a manuscript from Lake Constance. But the important thing is that there's a distinct connection between these companions, and them going to different areas. But also with Saint Gall in particular, it's his symbols. His symbol is both the Tau and the bear, and it seems that some of his followers should be connected with Harold Fairhair. This also fits with what we know that was going on during Athelstan's reign. There are stories about St. Dunstan. St. Dunstan's, the stories about him were that he was a blacksmith and that he used his tongues to keep the devil away. Yeah, that's the metaphors. And we're not going to go into it now, but you can see here the one picture has grabbing a wolf by the, or is it a bear? A wolf? Looks like a wolf by the nose with his tongs. And the other picture has someone looking at someone with very spiky hair. And also, please look at the finger gestures. It's an open hand and a pointed finger. And the hair is all spiky with like rays of the sun coming out of it. And so we know that there is a relationship directly between Athelstan, St. Dunstan, and blacksmithing and keeping these other people, these pagans, these devils, these other heathens away. I went back and added in the other information that we had already deduced about the Ulfberht swords and put them into the diagram. Um, one at the top I just put in about St. Dunstan and the iconography again of the set of tongs. And it said that he was in charge of both the Church of the East and the Church of the West. That's very interesting because we have of the first group that we see was that the Ulfberht plus T, that those were made of crucible steel, while the Ulfberht, say T plus, were made out of layered steel. One is of a Eastern tradition, the other one is of a Western tradition. So that seemed to be notable. Whereas the other iron and steel identified would fall into these other categories, something in the middle of the two. Next, adding in the categories, the groupings with the reverse marks, we had deduced before that the first reverse mark was that of Håkon. The second one was of his uncle Sigurd Håkonsson. And for this one here, that the fourth one was Thorgil Sprackling, which I'll talk about in a minute. The other two we are his other nephews, Håkon's other nephews, but we haven't looked to deduce who they might be yet. Some important things we were noticing about the Pommels, though, was that the X and H Petersen type Pommels are found in each group, but there are some types of pommels that are only found in other groups, such as the E, the K, and the O, that we don't see them elsewhere. But we see the S and the R in two different groups, Håkon's group and Sigurd's group. And none of this is really very surprising, but the reason, especially the X and the H, because they're found all over, but we wanted to understand why these connections, what is grouping these specific ones together. What I was also noticing is, okay, that the sword was from this picture here, and that was also found in a manuscript with the picture next to it of what I think is Athelstan giving was also, notice the three-low pommel, giving the swords to what may be Håkon. What's interesting is there are 13 different figures here, and before our group had, we found when we had the 59 swords, 13 groups. So whether or not that is a coincidence or not, I'm not sure. Something else that I was noticing when I was going through some of the manuscripts, as I said, if we take this picture here, notice how the picture in the center, how the kings have different helmets on it or crowns on them. But what I wanted to know is that the guy in the center also looks similar to the person in the far painting. But what really struck me was that when I was looking through from the same period of time, the Gospel of Saint Otto. These are supposed to be the gifts to Otto, and they're the different groups who are bringing him the gifts. And what I was noticing was all these hand gestures, and also that she's carrying here one of those cornucopias. And when I looked at here, the hands, the disc, these shapes, the interesting feet position, all was making me think of where have I seen this before? And when I was then looking back, it seemed that there was a connection. That if I begin here with the Petersen O, they look like toes, and like down here. The M looks like a T, and a T as in a Tau, and the Tau is the early Christian symbol. I believe too now that the Ulfberht plus T. The T is actually a tau. Then when I was looking at here, the disc, that looks like the disc pommel that we see here, that we get with Ethelred the ill-advised or well-advised, depending who you, or unready, depending on translation. But also when I was looking at here again, the Gospel of Otto, here we have this shape, was it this Brazil nut or whatever you want to call it, pommel, and that looks very much like this here. That's when I was starting to realize that there's something about this. And then going back to the other pommels, here when we have things like the H, there's a V that we tend to find together, that these look very similar to what we find, say, at the top of churches as well. Also, what I was noticing is the top of Athelstan's crown here, that also being like the little 3 dots on top here. And well, the more I started to look, the more similarities that I started to see. So it seemed that this might be our key. There is also parallels with the so-called Lewis chess pieces, particularly with all of the women having the hand up. And if we look, we have a few of them holding a disc, other ones holding the horn, and there are even very similarities with the folds in the cloth. All this will need more research in the future. From a manuscript in Switzerland at Lake Constance, where we said that near St. Gall's Abbey, we see here a 3-lobe pommel and a guy, looks like, with a broken sword that has obviously had writing on it, and also that spiky hair that I mentioned before, that Saint Dunstan was tweaking his nose with a pair of tongs. In the same manuscript, we see this person, basically what looks like that they're forging, but what's very interesting is what they're forging looks to be round, like it's a crucible steel ingot. And also the X's and the lines on it also really look very much like the marks on the Ulfberht blades, as well as the suggestion of water. I wanted to add one more piece of information that I thought really sums up and ties all this research together. This figure in the middle with the horn and the hands really struck a chord with me, and I knew that I had seen that face before somewhere. This is supposedly an image of Harold Fairhair, and it says that it's him receiving the kingdom from his father. But his father doesn't have breasts, and, well, we didn't think so. And if you look at these similarities with the hand and the crown and the clothing, and it seems that this might be Torah. Despite all the research, it seems that with the Lewis chess pieces, no one has really given any attention to the marks down on the sides of the chairs, but it seems to be that that's their last name. And if we look at this, the one looks like Torah and the other one looks like Haken, and it's just like what we see the rune on the blades. So that sort of brings us in a nice circle with the research. Indeed, if you look at the kings from the Lewis set, you will notice that the swords, some of them have different pommels. Some of the pommels are being covered, but what's most striking is that they have these different zigzag lines on them, and it seems that that is probably indicating the the marriage system, the mating pattern that they have. There's more information that I would present in the future that is pulling out all this information from the swords and the different family systems and mating patterns, because we can compare it with the genealogy, and it's all there. So to conclude, the pommel's shape represents a religious affiliation, and it represents different sects of Christianity. And in turn, we can infer the different kinship and mating systems. Some of the discoveries that we're finding out here is basically one is Hawkins' mother's family, and probably even more importantly, that the Lewis chessmen are actually icons, um, not a chess set with lots of missing pieces. And that the iconography, the runes on the blades and the Lewis chess pieces represent the names of people, or at least families and identity. Um, Thank you very much.